Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, no cake if you want to be on medicAID, at least according to Dr. Oz anyway. Nicotine pouches are apparently poisoning children in the USA at a surprising rate. And what happens if you have testosterone gel in your hands and you shake them with others? What is your body doing once you stop drinking alcohol other than being sad? China's clean air could be accelerating global warming, and other news items that you can find at the timestamps given below. We'll start with Dr. Oz and yet another bad take from him, which is basically everything he says, but
I can't figure this out, Dr. Oz. I get that you do a lot of good on your show. I understand that you give a lot of information that's great information about health, and you do it in a way that's easily understandable. You're very talented. You're obviously very... I can't figure this out, Dr. Oz. I can't figure this out, Dr. Oz.
Specifically this time, it's about medicAID. This is America's supposed safety net for healthcare. It's not really. It is the illusion of a safety net very similar to an invisible bridge. It's supposed to provide you with all the support you could possibly need, and yet it does nothing when put to use. But no. The catch here is that it's all based on him bringing a cake to a particular show on TV. And unfortunately, what they're doing is that they're making a lot out of it, but they're also not necessarily misrepresenting what Oz has done and has done, will do, and probably will keep doing. We can't help but find a painful irony in this. Dr. Oz is quoted as saying, "Be vital, do the most you can do to really live up to the potential. You are God-given potential to live a full and healthy life." And Oz said yesterday at the carrot cake between him and Varney, "Don't eat carrot cake, eat real food." Whilst also talking about the role that Medicare is there to make sure that you can do so, while simultaneously providing nothing really substantial to support people, thereby ensuring that disease does allow them to live up to their potential as a plague carrier. But that's about it. We would not be surprised to find that at some point very soon, Dr. Oz starts promoting the next news item, which is essentially that people are trying to spread drinking bleach again as a cure for things. We've been over this before. Even if you use buzzwords to hide it, it is still bleach. It is still bad for you. Don't do it. No matter what you want to call it, MMS, a miracle mineral solution, or whatever else it is, in this case aerobic oxygen, it is the same thing. It is bleach. Understand, there is a difference between a bleach, or bleach in general, and bleach is in the thing you buy off the shelf in a store. A bleach is anything that can remove coloration from something. This is why MMS, or whatever you want to call it instead, is a bleach. Bleach in the supermarket, or wherever else you buy it from, is a bleach, but also just called, in generic terms, bleach. There's a distinction between these, and it's simply that one is a common name, one is a name as a category. An MMS is a subset of the category. It acts as a bleach. You could use it as bleach too if you want, like the standard supermarket type bleach, but that doesn't mean that it's safer. And so, drinking it is bad. Do not do it. We cannot stress that enough. It is bad for you. No matter what you think is coming out of your ass after doing an enema or drinking it, it is not parasites. It is not worms. It is not detoxing you. It is your literal bowels being washed out of your insides because you are damaging yourself. It can also cause issues around methemoglobinemia, that is, where your red blood cells lose their ability to carry oxygen. It can cause kidney damage, and there are all sorts of other problems that it can cause. Don't do it. If you for some reason think that MMS, or whatever you want to call it as, is actually not a bleach, we have a whole video explaining why you are factually wrong. Admittedly, you will need to actually put aside your insanity and understand something about chemistry and the basic equations we show to demonstrate that what happens when you combine MMS base compound with an acid becomes a bleach. We even show you how a bleach works. So, no. In other poisoning-related news, we have nicotine, but supposed claims that nicotine poisoning rates have surged amongst children in particular between 2020 and 2023. This is all down to nicotine pouches. This is a particularly weird product, otherwise known as white snus, and what they're often confused with is something like a sweetener or sugar packet. What they're intended to do is be put between the lip and the gum, so that, much like, say, nitrogen used for heart attack, it's slowly absorbed into the membranes inside your mouth, into the bloodstream, and from the bloodstream around your body, and just like, say, smoking. The difference between this and smoking is rather obviously that since you're absorbing it orally, and sort of mucosal, you are, instead of having to worry about inhaling various noxious compounds, you're only consuming a single noxious compound. The data is based on pediatrician reporting of poison at the US Nationwide Children's Hospital, so this is somewhat, let's say, questionable. The reason we describe this as questionable boils down to one issue. The report is based on children under 6 to start with, which, okay, it's a young age, but that's within reason. It's the surge. It's only described as being an increase of 763%, which sounds like a terrifying increase. But we need to talk about the base number before you have to worry about that. The base number itself has gone up from roughly 134 cases over that entire time frame. Understand though that this is all kinds of poisoning, not just from nicotine pouches, but they do make up a notable portion of this, which is the important part of it. Although not the only element, they are a notable element, which is where we need to point out the issue here. We could tell you that something has increased, but if we don't tell you which particular aspect under that has increased, then we're not telling you a lot of information that's useful. Why nicotine pouches are particularly worrying is that if, rather than having them in the mucous membrane in your mouth and absorbing them that way, you instead eat them, you are getting more or less the entire dose of nicotine in one go. It is a much larger immediate dose of nicotine versus the much slower release from in your mouth. And obviously children are unlikely to keep them in between their teeth and their lips, so they will basically just eat them whole, and this leads to a huge dose, and also children are small, therefore they get a much higher dose, and relative to their size it is, well, getting close, if not, is poisonous. Which, this is terrible if you like children. If you don't like children, well, if you are, for example, now trying to stop consuming nicotine, you may be worried about, say, a rage or aggression. The next news item may help you with that. It claims that a dietary supplement can decrease aggression by up to 28%. The claim is that omega-3 fatty acids are going to help you in being less angry. We would argue that decreasing video game lag is the only way to stop people from being angry, but that's only going to work for lag their Tourette's. For everybody else, well, they're probably not so helpful. And honestly, neither is this study necessarily, because it is a meta-analysis. Understand, we are critical of them in claiming that they are definitive proof of anything. What we do believe is that they show the broad general pattern, so then you need to run an actual test of what is claimed to then establish that the broad general pattern applies. A lot of people will try and do it the other way around, that is to say that individual studies prove everything. No, because an individual study could theoretically be an anomaly. This is why a meta-analysis like this, that has 29 randomized control trials using under 4,000 individuals, is nice, but not great, and this is yet another weakness. A large number of trials, and a relatively small number of participants relative to the number of trials that were run. What they did find, for what it's worth, is a 28% reduction in aggression across just about every variable that they could worry about. So this does indicate that, yes, it could be useful, but it could also be that, well, those who are consuming more omega-3 rich foodstuffs are also more likely to be in a situation where they don't need to worry about things that would cause aggression. For example, consuming more fish may be more closely associated with, say, a more active lifestyle, being wealthier, having just a better diet in general, all sorts of things that could be the better explanation than just omega-3. So it's interesting, but it's definitely not anything definitive yet, and it definitely requires a greater depth of investigation than what's been done so far. Something that will not help with aggression is testosterone, but testosterone in any form really. Testosterone gels, though, are a little more challenging because they are a topical treatment, and therefore they affect you and possibly others.
You're not the boy I fell in love with last week during free period. I'm leaving you.
You're not leaving me. You try to leave me and I'll kill you, bitch.
You can't treat people like this.
And it's weird because a lot of the time it doesn't really get touched on very much. Why is it that if you have testosterone applied topically, does it affect other people? And first case has really popped up only a few years ago and has since basically been circulating around in the media as though it was some sort of circus sideshow freak exhibit. But it is still interesting. The problem is that hormone therapies, whether we are talking about trans individuals, whether we are talking about simply using hormones for, say, hair or muscle or anything else, there are all sorts of ways that these hormones are used, are still relatively understudied. Understand, it's kind of hard to figure out what to do with people because people are complicated, so it's a good reason why it's taking time to figure out what to do. So, hormone therapies, safe while used properly, can still have a certain, let's say, caveats that need to be addressed over time.
Ooh, if anyone needs me, I'll be in the Angry Dome.
The various controversial media coverage has, of course, led to, let's say, a greater interest publicly. After all, you see a high-level news item that says X, Y, or Z causes something amazing, people look at it and go, oh, that's terrible, I don't want that to happen to me, and then proceed to get all panicked. The same way anti-vaxxers have become a thing. But the question is, if you are actually doing it correctly, is there a problem? And particularly when we're talking about topical testosterone. The answer is, only for a short time after application, if at all. That's the important thing here. The instructions from most producers of this are fairly straightforward. Apply only to the area that you need to apply it to. You wash your hands immediately. You cover the skin once dry, and you basically avoid contact for a few hours. When you do that...
I don't have those kind of muscles.
Well, you could if you use these.
Steroids?
Transferring any testosterone from you to a child, a partner, a stranger even, are practically minimal, if at all non-existent. So, yes. There is some concern, but the concern is often overhyped, overblown, and not really an accurate description of the situation, which is basically the media in a nutshell. Moving on to similar news, but this time regarding drinks primarily, but sweetened beverages. That is, say for example, Coca-Cola, or Diet Coke in this case, Pepsi and so on. The sweetener erythritol found in these is, according to new research, associated with concerning worries about, say, damage to your blood-brain barrier and stroke. This is not the first time that such claims have come up. Various sweeteners over the years have been accused of being all sorts of dangerous in all sorts of ways, and it's essentially the boogeyman of the big drink industry. Oh no, don't consume that because it's bad for you. And yes, everything is bad for you, in the right dose. This is why the research is, to be blunt about this, somewhat questionable. And we'll get to why shortly, but understand, we are going to make this very clear at the start. Dose makes poison. Obviously, if you are consuming several bottles of whatever drink that's sweetened with this a day, it's not good for you. But then again, if you were to consume a number of bottles of water a day for you, it's probably not good for you because you would be causing something called hyponatremia. So you can see how dose is very important in this. And it's why, to be blunt about it, we're not a huge fan of this study. There's other issues too though. They were looking at blood-brain barrier cells. So this is a cell-based study, and as you'll see, there is very little you can gain directly out of this sort of study. You do need to put it in an organism to understand what's going on for very important reasons. Anything in adequate volumes, quantities, concentrations, etc., in a petri plate, test tube, etc., will kill or damage cells. This is just what happens. If you put it in a living organism, it's far more complicated, and it's far more accurate to what really goes on. This is not to say what they found about oxidative stress isn't true. And to be blunt about it, just about everything will cause a degree of oxidative stress. Even living causes oxidative stress. We presume that the researchers are not encouraging people to stop living for the same reason that it causes harm. Admittedly, the dose of life you may want to deal with at times does vary. The research does point out that well, at least the researchers found, it might be better to say, that erythritol causes changes in two things: nitric oxide and endothelin-1. Nitric oxide is used as a dilator in blood vessels, and it's even used in some cases using something called GTN, which is a blood vessel dilator when you have, say, a stroke, or not necessarily a stroke, but something that involves a blood clot that blocks your blood flow. So stroke in the brain, in the heart, it's obviously a heart attack, and anywhere else that a clot causes some sort of blockage. Endothelin-1, on the other hand, is going to be associated with a reduction in nitric oxide production and a greater constriction of blood vessels. The combination of that, plus the decreased activity of tissue plasminogen activator, means that you are more likely to develop something like a blood clot and therefore a blockage within your blood vessels, particularly in the brain. We are, to be quite frank, disappointed that the researchers will quite happily state that they recognize their research is flawed, and that they instead need to run the same tests using what is effectively an organ on a chip using a blood vessel. We would honestly say that if you are confident in what you have found, you don't go to organ on a chip next necessarily. It seems like it would be more appropriate to say that you should go to some sort of animal model, at least on a small scale. Because if you can establish at this point that you are that worried about this, well, you should probably go to the next step up, and an ethics board would probably look at this and go, yeah, okay, fair enough. Especially given the wide prevalent use of this. But then again, they may not be that confident in their findings. Moving on to the sadness that is to stop drinking alcohol, and what your body does when this happens.
To alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems.
It's essentially withdrawal. All the usual symptoms go along with this, at least initially.
I was thinking along the lines of no TV and no beer make Homer something.
Now, how long that withdrawal symptoms will last will vary considerably, but for example, according to this article which goes through the entire process, after 24 hours, you have no alcohol left in your body, which, that's fine. The alcohol you consume will cause you to pee more frequently, so that obviously means you don't need to drink as much. After about a week, you begin to get a little less sleepy. Your sleep is not disrupted as much, you can rest more effectively, and everything works the way it should be. Your liver begins to improve.
Yay!
Good morning, family.
You sure I can't make you some oatmeal with blueberries?
Not today, honey. I promised to pick up coffee for everyone on my team to celebrate our
After a month, other parts of your body begin to heal, and overall, you are improving your well-being. After 6 months, your liver should be completely healed of any damage you've done to it, and after a year, your risk of a lot of secondary diseases, comorbidities, and so on, it goes down a lot, along with your risk for, say, hypertension. Now, do we agree entirely that this is something you should be doing? Not necessarily. And we don't agree entirely for a very straightforward reason. It very much comes back to dose makes poison again. That is, if you are drinking excessively, you probably have bigger issues. And those bigger issues are going to be things you need to address, along with obviously drinking. On top of that, you don't really gain that much necessarily, depending on how much you are drinking. If you're only drinking a moderate amount of alcohol, typically it's considered 1 or 2 glasses of alcohol a week, so essentially a glass of wine with dinner on a weekend or something similar, you don't have much to worry about, and you certainly won't be gaining that much relative to being able to enjoy your meal. So it's very important to take this particular publication with a lot of hesitancy. Going now to Australia, and we are forced to ask, what the fuck is up with this country? Not only do they basically get themselves burned out every summer because their entire environment has evolved around the idea of catching fire, but they have animals that glow under UV lights. They have just about every deadly animal in the world, or at least at the top of them. You have weirdness in terms of just how their plants grow, what their plants do, other than catching fire, and the fact they have some of the most insane plants in the world. Their animals are primarily made up of mammals and monotremes, and things are just bizarre, and they get more bizarre now. Australian lizards appear to have bone armour. Yes, under their skin, it would appear that they have armour made up of bone. It's a relative of the Komodo dragon, which is somewhat funny given what we're talking about, that under the skin of the goanna, which is a rather large lizard in Australia, a monitor lizard, they appear to have bits of bone that help to form an almost chainmail-like structure. We do wonder if Australia might not perhaps be secretly experimenting with the idea of making their own version of Godzilla. The research looked at tens of these monitor lizards and found that they all have this odd adaptation, and that the adaptation is called an osteoderm. It's a small bone that does a number of things. It can provide protective armor functions, but also be involved in, say, thermoregulation. The question is, why, what, and how? And on top of that, why? Why is Australia full of these bizarre creatures? Will Australia now have to worry about the goannas and the emus teaming up together to fight them, because that'll probably be another war they lose, and probably lose really badly. Next we shift to more broad environmental news, and this time looking at China specifically, and how China's clean air could be increasing global warming. Now, saying China has clean air is a bit of an overstatement, let's say, as they have some of the worst air in the world. So much so that, at least for the Chinese Olympics recently, they literally had to stop people from driving. That is how far they had to go to provide at least the semblance of clean air in their capital city. This brings us to what's going on in particular detail though with China, and at least since 2010, the global warming rate has supposedly picked up. Now, we're not going to judge the global warming rate by itself, but...
Chet, you are a fucking retard, you know that? Even if global warming were real, which all proven scientific data shows it isn't, it would take millions of years for a climate shift to happen.
What the study is supposed to claim is that the effects of China and Asia as a whole appear to be affecting this more. The researchers believe that the combination of changing sulfur with shipping and Chinese better air quality may be linked to global warming changes. Specifically, that the shipping changes using less sulfur was only part of the explanation. The other part being that the 75% reduction in East Asian sulfur dioxide emissions appear to be playing a role, and this can be coming from places like, say, coal power plants. The reduction in sulfur emissions from these plants, due to various legal requirements and so on, to combat air pollution, could be what's led to a change in essentially cloud-based CO2 concentrations. They're arguing that the sheer volume of crap in the air, in the form of various CO2 emissions, could have actually been masking the full implications of what's going on with climate change. The reason they say this is that the amount of smoke and other pollution you put up into the atmosphere from these areas would also help in protecting Earth from a lot of the heat that would come in from the sun, thereby preventing us from getting as warm. It's essentially a catch-22. It stops heat from getting in, but some still does, while it also prevents heat from getting out, but some still does. But overall, the amount coming in and the amount getting out is not equal, and so more heat still enters Earth's atmosphere. We do have some concerns about the fact they've basically run a shotgun approach of modeling using 160 simulations using the 8 current global climate models. So that's a very broad approach, and they did find that the clean air in places like China did increase global warming by around 0.07 degrees Celsius, and no, there won't be any freedom units. When they adjusted for other long-term trends and so on, they increased that figure to 0.023 degrees Celsius, and then bumped that up to 0.33 degrees Celsius. So that's a significant contributing factor to things that are, well, not good for us, but importantly, in terms of what they're finding, we are somewhat skeptical. Not the least for the reasons that, particularly in China, whilst clean air has been a, let's say, intermittent focus of the Communist Party, they haven't reliably done so, and they continue to be one of the major CO2 emitters. So this is not exactly a reliable way of claiming what's happening is happening. In similar sorts of environmental news, we need to talk about actual risks, sort of. It's that children in Missouri might be at much greater risk of cancer due to radioactive waste exposure. We would argue that just being in Missouri is radioactive waste, but we're judging Missouri a little bit harshly there. The problem is a project called the Manhattan Project, something you may have heard of. It's a project from World War II where they decided to drop 2 giant bombs made out of nuclear material on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and then Japan surrendered because fuck that shit. But the fallout from this is fairly straightforward. Well, in this case, basically fallout, it is the waste from said production was stored in drums or even left out in the open in parts of St. Louis, which is a major city in Missouri. The problem is that not only did the radiation affect the local areas, but also the Coldwater Creek, a major tributary. This tributary then spread the contaminated water that was now irradiated into parts of America downstream. So this is not a great place to start. America already has issues around, say, Flint, Michigan, and lead, and now they've got nuclear waste. The results sound all kinds of terrifying, but there is an important caveat to it. The first is this. The data looked at roughly 4,200 people who spent their childhood in and around the Coldwater Creek. That is the tributary that feeds into the major river in the area and is what should be contaminated. They then checked this against cases of cancer in the same area, and they essentially found that 24% of the individuals they were looking at had cancer at some point. This isn't great, but then again, this is also not exactly out of expected ranges. So we would argue that there is already a fairly good explanation for this, except for what comes next. The exposure had let's say, a proximity issue. The closer you were to the Coldwater Creek, the greater your risk of developing cancer, an increase of up to 44%. This number alone might also be somewhat understating their findings, because you can't include people who are dead because, well, part they can't give consent, not unless you're a necromancer, but also, well, they're dead. You can't get their data, so you wouldn't know if they had cancer. As such, it's a not necessarily definitive finding, but it's a strong correlation. You might immediately be thinking now, those bastard government people, the quote, let's call it, of the most terrifying words in the world are, "We're from here to help you and we're from the government," don't apply so much in this case. There is a, let's say, legal protection in place for those who have been affected by radioactive fallout. It's called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, and you can claim compensation from the government for this sort of thing, and Coldwater Creek in this case is included. So no, it's not ideal, but at least in this instance there is a, let's say, a much better situation than for many others. Next we go to exercise news, and talking about how certain exercises are supposed to help with insomnia, which we would argue is impossible. Nothing solves insomnia. You just drink more coffee and it'll go away eventually. No, it is actually something of an issue, but the issue itself, at least for this study, is, let's be blunt about it, not great. They're relying on pulling together results from 22 different studies or trials, and they're also looking at only 1,350 or so individuals. So this is not great to start with. It's small in terms of total numbers, and the number of studies that they looked at to try and accrue this data altogether as an aggregate really isn't that much. It would indicate that a lot of these, let's call them studies, were very small in size. What they found was that yoga, tai chi, walking and jogging were the most helpful for insomnia, which we would argue yoga and tai chi are perhaps one of the most boring things in the world, and so naturally you would fall asleep. Walking is something everyone does every day, so unless you're specifically talking about a particular aspect of walking, not so much. And, well, jogging. Jogging is for a special class of people that, well, enough said. Okay, we're being facetious, but the issue here is that none of these things are things that haven't been brought up before as solutions in many cases, and oftentimes it's just being part of a healthy lifestyle. So this isn't particularly helpful, as it would appear that what they're suggesting is to rehash what's already been suggested, and in testing it hasn't necessarily been that helpful. Next is news that we're more hesitant to discuss, only because we suspect before very long it will be either proven wrong, retracted, or something similar. And it is that researchers claim to have found a new structure inside human cells. This is, let's say, an interesting claim. It's a membrane-bound organelle, which appears to be important, at least somewhat, in sort of discarding or processing various content within the cell. Essentially, it is the trash bin of your cell, and it's called hemophysom. This is sort of useful, if it's true, as it might be important in the function of cellular machinery and certainly in sustaining certain cell functions. But we're also skeptical that it's actually what's claimed. For example, we had the issue last week alone of the retraction over the discovery of a new brain cell, and obviously there have been other examples over the years. The method they used is also likely to introduce some modicum of, let's say, artifacts. What they've done is called cryogenic electron tomography. It's basically they freeze the cell and then use a big fancy electron microscope to analyze them by shooting electrons at it. You can imagine how freezing cells is likely to introduce extra things, particularly given the nature of freezing and how cells don't like it. Even if what they found is what they may think they found, which is largely just a vesicle, vesicles are already a thing known in cells. The only difference between what this vesicle does and what other vesicles do is that they claim this one is slightly more advanced and technically different, which, again, is skeptical about that. But it's not to say that they're not correct, but we think it's very premature to claim this, or at least say that, yes, they have definitively found some sort of a new kind of cell, or at least a cell organelle. But finally, we have the last news item for this week, and it is all about Saturn, and specifically Saturn's moon Titan. We've spoken about this before, but Saturn's moon Titan could well have all the conditions required for life. Admittedly, very early stages of life. We say that in terms of if you were to take Earth and go back, way back to primordial Earth, it has the requisite conditions to make things that are very basic. In this case, we are talking about the very earliest signs of life. So if Titan was to develop life, for example, an alternative to humanity, it would still be millions, if not billions of years away. What it has is a necessary quasi-circulatory system, where water and various other compounds are circulated in a way that ensures not only are they constantly mixed, but they're mixed in a way that they have enough energy to then react and produce something more exciting. This would theoretically produce something like our previous news item on vesicles, but these vesicles are, for all intents and purposes, just bubbles made up of lipids or fats, and inside that there may be some sort of very rudimentary membrane made up of something closer to a protein, or possibly some sort of protein or amino acids tied together with those lipids. If you were to look at this in a slightly different context, you could basically say the conditions on Titan are a recreation of what was done with the Yuri Miller experiments, except this obviously predates that and is in space, which is slightly different, but it gives you an idea about what we're talking about. Importantly, you only need to have a relatively consistent introduction of energy. We're not saying consistent energy levels, just that it gets introduced relatively constantly, and that it is constantly cycled in the form of the water moving. This ensures that the entire reaction continues. That gives you an important structure that is amphiphilic. That is something that is polar on one end. Think of the bilipid membrane on a human cell. It has on the top end a sulfur. Sulfur on the top end is allowing it to essentially be exposed to water without breaking down. On the inside though, you have a lipid. The lipid tail hides from the water. And this creates a structure where you have the two tails, one on each side, pointing inwards, and the phosphates on each end, or the sulfur on each end, are pointing out, and this ensures that it always remains oriented that way. This would allow for the self-assembly of these structures. That would allow for the creation of what, for all intents and purposes, could be described as a sort of vesicle, if you will. Now, this vesicle's use and how stable it is will vary, but theoretically, they could accumulate over time, so long as, again, we have that sustained energy introduction and constant shifting of water. and that would then allow for the creation of a very rudimentary vesicle that would be holding water internally. That water would theoretically contain various chemicals. Those chemicals could then be reacted, and those reactions could then lead to something more complex in the very distant future. What we mean by that is that inside of that vesicle, you have a relatively protected environment. This means, for example, if you were to start forming very basic amino acids, those amino acids could then start attaching themselves to each other and assembling a very early prototype protein for all intents and purposes. That doesn't necessarily mean it's what's happening, but it does provide the necessary environment for something more significant than just lipids and, in this case, exactly what we're talking about here with a vesicle. Is it definitive? No. But is it interesting? Oh yes. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting yourself, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.